is the second half of the 1960s, which were dominated by two very powerful figures, JFK, who unfortunately was assassinated 3 years into office in Dallas, Texas, and his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, takes over. And we talked last time about how they were similar. They are both cold warriors, anti-communist. They are both the legacy of the New Deal and wanted to continue the New Deal, but very different methods, both dominant in their own ways. JFK had looks, had wit, had charm. If you ever have time, you can pull up some of the news conferences that JFK held. They are just fascinating to listen to. He enjoyed reporters. He was very witty. He communicated beautifully with them. Lyndon Johnson, on the other hand, who also got along okay with reporters, is not charming, is not witty, was always a little bit insecure about this education because he had, as he said, a degree from little old San Marcos instead of a Harvard law degree, but a tremendous energy, incredibly forceful personality. He came from half an hour down the road in Stonewall, Texas, just west of Austin, a very rural ranching family that had been in Texas for several generations. They made their money originally off of ranching and then farming. And if you know anything about the hill country, the soil is not very deep. The rock is very close to the surface. And by LBJ's generation, it was pretty worn out soil. But the family, historically, his father had supported civil rights. His father was a populist, fought for the common man, was elected a representative, and served in Austin in the Texas legislature, and often took the son, the eldest son, Lyndon, with him. So Lyndon grew up on the streets of Austin part of the time, having people address his father, showing great respect for his father. But by the time Lyndon becomes an adult, father was no longer in office. The ranch had gone bust. He couldn't farm the land, and he ends up at the age of 50, the father, shoveling gravel on a road crew to try and pay for the family. So things changed in Lyndon Johnson's family. He graduated from Johnson City High School. He was first in his class, but the class only had 6 students in it. But clearly this is a very bright child. Never got over the fact that he went to San Marcos, that he considered himself inferior to many of the people around him. And on graduation, he went and became a teacher in the little town of Cotulla, Texas. Completely Mexican-American school. This was an incredibly poor little farming town in South Texas. And even Lyndon Johnson, who grew up pretty poor, was shocked by the conditions there. He never, ever forgot it. And I would recommend, it's all of like 2 minutes long, Google Lyndon Johnson Cotulla speech. Cotulla, Cotulla. It says a lot about Lyndon Johnson and his psychology. At the age of 28, he's elected a representative in the New Deal Congress in the middle of the 1950s. It was a pretty good job at the time, and this is the middle of the Depression. 1948, he becomes a senator. He became majority leader in the Senate shortly after that. He spent 23 years in Congress. He had a lot of experience in politics. And the title of one of his biography books is Master of the Senate. He controlled the Senate. He loved and idolized FDR. His job during the Depression was to set up water and electricity for rural Texas. So at the end of the Depression, everybody in Texas knows the name of Lyndon Johnson. He turned the lights on. How did he do this? If you go down to Town Lake and you go to the dam at the end of Enfield, there are plaques on that dam that say when it was built, which was the middle of the 1930s, and the guy who organized it was Lyndon Johnson. He had a good friend of his named Herman Brown, and he asked Herman Brown, he gave him the contract to build the first dam. Why? Because Herman Brown had 2 tractors, and most people didn't in the Depression. Herman Brown went on to become the founder of Brown and Root one of the biggest construction companies in the country. So when Lyndon Johnson is running for political office, Herman Brown called him every time and said, "Hey, Lyndon, how much money you need for this campaign?" And Lyndon would throw a figure out, and a check would arrive from Herman Brown, from Brown and Root. So the Brown family had a lot of connections with LBJ's political campaigns. Lyndon Johnson, very different personality than JFK, huge energy, huge ambition, had anger issues, very vain, never relaxed, clearly hyperactive person. But all of his energy went into politics. He didn't play sports. He was not interested in the arts. He rarely went to movies. He had one interest, and that was politics. Along the way, he wasn't even interested, unlike JFK, in women so much. Had one affair outside of marriage that we know about, maybe others, but they were not serious because he didn't care about it. He cared about power and politics. He married when he was young and traveling around rural Texas, setting up these dams. And the dams, of course, created electricity, and then rural people had electricity. The hill country west of Austin was one of the poorest areas in the nation in the 1930s, and 95% of people had no electric power. By 1940, 95% do. So you can see where Lyndon Johnson's popularity comes from. He turned the lights on. But wherever he traveled, he would find one of the wealthiest men in town, find out if they had a daughter, and date the daughter. And that's how he met Lady Bird, is the wealthy daughter, the only child of a pretty wealthy guy in East Texas. Lyndon was very, very pragmatic, using any means necessary to pass his bills. Flattery, favors, occasionally blackmail, if necessary, and physical force. If you look at slide 18, there's a wonderful demonstration of the half Johnson and the full Johnson. This is physical intimidation. Johnson was a big guy, 6'3", 200-something pounds, fairly athletic, and basically he would pin other congressmen up against the wall and lean into them until they agreed to vote for his bills. This is flat-out physical intimidation. Nobody would sit next to him, I have read, in committee meetings because he would kick you in the legs underneath the table, and everybody learned to sit far away from him. He was, frankly, a bully, but he got bills through. Some indication of this, one of his friends in Congress said, "You felt like a St. Bernard had licked your face for an hour and then pawed you all over." He would not let go until you agreed to follow his positions. His nickname in Congress, unlike JFK, was the Playboy of the Senate. In the Senate, LBJ was known as the Great Persuader. He knew everything about every senator. He knew your wife's names, he knew their birthdays, he knew your kids, where they went to school, he knows your dog's name, and all of your family would get a birthday card on their birthdays. Women would get flour on Mother's Day. He also knew all the dirt on everybody, and he was not above using blackmail. So if he wanted to get something, you better vote with Johnson, or on the front page of the Austin paper, you would find a picture of yourself with a few girlfriends going into the Driscoll Hotel on a Friday night. Lyndon said correctly, he was misjudged. He had a strong Texas accent, a strong Southern accent, and he said, "No Southerner is ever going to be elected president in the 1960s in my lifetime." Kind of right. He wasn't elected. He came into office accidentally when JFK is assassinated. Once he got into office, he had no problem using the power that he had. And that's why that Cotulla speech, I think, is very interesting. Great story. Lots of stories about Lyndon Johnson. Great story. And he's talking to the Chancellor of Germany. Met him for the first time diplomatically, and the German chancellor says, "I understand you were born in a log cabin." which number one is not true. Lyndon Johnson was born in a small house in Johnson City. It was not a log cabin. It was a middle-class home at the time. Anyway, the German chancellor said, "Oh, I heard you were born in a log cabin." And Lyndon Johnson turned around quick as a flash and said, "No, no, no, you have me confused with Abraham Lincoln. I was born in a manger." The man had no self-doubt other than he was insecure about his educational background. Don't forget that Texas at the time was Democratic. Texas has not been a Republican state except for the last 20, 25 years. Strong support for the New Deal. Texas was a poor southern state at the time. And Lyndon believed, with most Texans and most New Dealers, that the government could step in and help make people's lives better. He also, from his family history and from the start, supported civil rights. In 1957, he pushed for the first Civil Rights Act to be passed. He also supported Brown versus Board of Education. So the question with Lyndon Johnson becomes, how do you judge the means to the ends? Because his methods were not always the best, but many of his goals and what he accomplished oftentimes were. So he takes over in a moment of crisis in the middle of the Kennedy assassination, and he's very gracious about it. He rode on the plane back with Jackie Kennedy and the body of the president. She was still wearing her blood-stained suit from the assassination, and tries to comfort her and offer, "What can we do for you? What can we do to help you?" So his first year is a pretty strange one. He is in the footsteps of Kennedy, and that's always a difficult position. But he runs again in 1964 on his own, and he wins overwhelmingly. In his first State of the Union address in 1964, he lays out his Great Society program. And that's the hashtag for LBJ, is the Great Society. It had two parts to it. And this is slide 19. First of all, civil rights, which I'll talk about in a minute. The other half of it was his war on poverty. He had two goals: strengthen the economy and help the poor. And remember that a good number of poor people in America, particularly in the 1960s, were not just black, poor in all colors. So he puts together, and this is his signature event, the War on Poverty, which lasted from 64, the minute he's reelected, to 67, till Vietnam escalates. Did he eliminate poverty? That was the goal. No, he did not. Of course not. We still have poor people. But the War on Poverty, like Prohibition, worked for a good long while. 10 million people rose above poverty with the direct help of the U.S. government. It is very similar to the New Deal. That's what Lyndon Johnson had in mind. I'm putting together a new deal. The numbers, again, I'll never ask you, but interesting. Poverty dropped, general poverty of all races, 21%. 1 out of 5 people were poor in the 1960s, down to 12%. African Americans, 56%, dropped to 32%. Whites, 18% to 10%. And Lyndon Johnson realized, how do you eliminate poverty? You can't just do one thing. You have to coordinate all kinds of programs, because poverty is caused by multiple causes. Just feeding people does not end poverty. Just giving them a job does not end poverty. So what he did basically is create a program to attack all aspects of poverty. Job training. Get people better jobs. They will make more money. They will rise out of poverty. Lyndon Johnson, the Johnson administration, created the Job Corps, the Office of Economic Opportunity, Community Action Programs, and VISTA. VISTA, Volunteers in Service to America, was a domestic Peace Corps, and we still have programs like that today. Teach for America is a similar program. He provided legal aid to poor people who couldn't afford it and adult literacy programs, because illiteracy, particularly in the South, was still a problem. So you attack jobs and literacy. In housing, he created HUD, new department, Housing and Urban Development, passed fair housing laws, set up the Model Cities Plan, added the first Black cabinet member. Franklin Roosevelt did that, the first woman advisor, but the first Black cabinet member in the Housing and Urban Development Department, and also provided rent help for poor people. The Housing Act of 1960s created mass transit and also help for middle income people as well. Okay, so what they did was build new housing in urban ghettos, in urban poor areas. If you look at slide 21, you can see immediately what the problem with this was. The idea was a good one, urban renewal, tear down the slums, build decent housing. And when they were built, these were new apartments with new appliances, very clean, pretty good condition. What happened pretty quickly is that they deteriorated. They are now being torn down and have been being torn down for the last 20 years. This program was copied all over places, including European countries. I have seen areas exactly like this, actually outside Dublin and in places in England. The goal was tear down the slums, build better housing, and it was better housing. But what's missing here? There's no neighborhood. There's no corner bar. There's no corner grocery store. There's very few parks. There's no community. People are isolated in their apartments. This should sound real familiar lately to those of us with coronavirus stay-at-home orders. They didn't work. What happened, and I know this firsthand in Chicago, within 10 years, gangs took over these high-rise living situations. And again, you have the problem of getting to work, and where are you working if you live there? Where's the work here? There isn't a community here. And they became high crime areas. In fact, firemen would not even go in to these areas without a police escort because they'd be shot at by residents of these high rises. So they became horrible places, and they are now being torn down and replaced with low-rise, 2- and 3-story neighborhood housing. Great idea that didn't work. In healthcare, huge advance. Lyndon Johnson creates in 65 and 66 Medicare and Medicaid. Medicare for the elderly. How can you do this? They've been trying for close to 100 years to create Medicare. Franklin Roosevelt tried it. 82% of the public support it. Also money for medical research. Medicaid is medical care for the poor who cannot afford it. Of course, the consequence is that healthcare costs rise. Is this socialized medicine? Yeah, it's government-run medical care. Ask anybody who has Medicare if they want to give it up, and they'll fight you tooth and nail about it. So when we talk about socialized medicine, which is highly controversial and has arguments on both sides, we have socialized medicine. Medicare for the elderly, Medicaid for the poor, the VA for veterans, that's government-run health care. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. No, but it does provide health care at reasonable cost to large sections of the American public. Lyndon Johnson did that. In education, 1965, the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, money given to public and to parochial or church-run schools, 90% public support for this, based on the economic status of the student. So in other words, poor schools in poor areas got more money from the federal government and still do. I have a slide there for the other program that was started in the 1960s, which was Head Start, which most of us know about, early childhood education. This is one of the best government programs that was ever started. It helped little kids in underprivileged areas get ready for kindergarten and first grade. So they knew their numbers, they knew their colors, they knew their letters. They were not behind when they started. Also, part of this was a National Teacher Corps, the beginning of Teach for America, which is its replacement today. So you help government money to help make education better, because as Jefferson said, education is the core of everything. An educated public is vital in a democracy. He created food stamps, which are still highly controversial. Direct food aid to poor families. Of course, we did this during the Depression as well. Now they're, of course, on cards, but when they started, they were literally little stamps in a book. So food stamps. Again, there's arguments both ways on that. Hot school lunches were also created, free lunch programs. Now they're being run even though the schools are closed, because for many children, this is their food for the day. They expanded later on to include breakfast and also to include meals during the summertime. Part of this was also consumer protections, particularly with food, but basically you can't do anything with poor people until they're fed. And particularly the aim was feed children. Other things that were passed under Lyndon Johnson, in more environmental regulations, especially on water. The Great Lakes became cleaner. I know that. I was growing up in Chicago on Lake Michigan, and when I was a little kid, we would go swimming in the lake, and there would be whole clouds, whole schools of dead fish floating in the water. I don't know why my mother let me swim with dead fish, but anyway, that's what we did. Today, you don't see that. Lake Michigan is much cleaner. The Great Lakes are much cleaner today. Lyndon Johnson also set up the Foundation for the Arts, the Foundations for the Humanities, and NASA to expand the space program. So these are all continuations for the arts and humanities, continuations really of the WPA, or a new version of the WPA. Problems with it. First of all, one of the huge issues in inner cities, and that slide shows it very well, of those urban renewal houses, apartment complexes, is jobs. You can build the housing, you can help the schools, you can feed people, but if there are no jobs, that's a huge problem. And there were always a problem with enough jobs in urban centers until recently. The other problem with it, this is not cheap. These programs created huge deficits. By 1970, the U.S. deficit had doubled. Did it end all problems? No, but it helped half of those in poverty rise above poverty. That is millions and millions of people. Was there corruption? Was there waste? Yeah, not from what I have read, huge amounts, more than in the Depression, but nothing that was astronomical. Yeah, any big program has problems. The main problem that happened to the Great Society, why we did not end poverty completely, it was on its way to do that, is one word: Vietnam happened. And Lyndon Johnson's great ideas, the focus shifted to Vietnam. So next time I will talk about his Civil Rights Acts quickly, and then move into the war in Vietnam, which is the definition of quagmire. Quagmire is kind of like quicksand, only with mud. You step into it and you get sucked in deeper and deeper, which is exactly what happened to Lyndon Johnson. Take care, stay safe.